This is the video lecture for Lesson 26 in Clayton Croy's A Primer to Biblical Greek. In this lesson, we will introduce the Greek imperative. To review the imperative mood, remember that mood indicates how the action relates to reality, or how the subject views the action. So the imperative mood is the mood of command. It is the mood by which the subject hopes to bring about a particular action in another person or group of persons. So in English, we can have positive imperatives like walk or sleep or go to sleep. These are known as positive imperatives or commands. We also have negative imperatives, which are known as prohibitions. Things like do not talk or do not fear. In English, as in Greek, context will be our friend. What I mean by that is there will usually be other indicators in a Greek sentence that the prohibition or the command is being used. There will be other signals, in other words, that the verb is in the imperative mood rather than the indicative mood. To begin with, here are some forms of the imperative, both the present active imperative and the present middle passive imperative. And what I've done for you in these slides is to indicate the distinctive endings of the imperative. You must note that the second plural in all imperative forms is identical to the second plural of the indicative. Again, context will help us distinguish. But it is also important to know that that second plural form is sort of the basis of all the other forms except for the second singular. So you'll see that lueto looks a lot like the second plural luete, with the exception of the change to the vowel. So instead of having an epsilon, you have an omega. And you can see also with lueto-san that we've essentially dropped that epsilon and added the osan for the third person plural. So those are sort of the distinguishing marks. And the second singular, lue, is sort of the only exception to that rule with the present active. And the same is also true of the present middle passive imperative. Lu'u is sort of the only form that you have no context to discern. It's the only sort of purely new form. But you can see that lueste, the second plural, is the basis of the third singular and the third plural. So luesto is identical to lueste with the exception of the final vowel. And likewise, luestosan is identical to that second plural with the exception of the added osan ending, which indicates the third person plural imperative. Now, the very similar things occur in the aorist imperatives. So you'll see for the first aorist active imperative, lusate, that second plural, is the basis of third plural and the third singular. So the second singular, lusan, is really the only form that must be memorized. Otherwise, you have the sort of distinguishing omega at the end of lusato and the distinguishing osan at the end of lusatosan. Then if we look at the first aorist middle imperative, we see much of the same. Lusai, the second singular form, is the one that is unique. Other than that, the other forms are all related to the second plural lusaste. So with the third singular lusasto, we've dropped the epsilon and added an omega. And with the third plural lusastosan, we've dropped that epsilon and added that ending osan. Finally, for the first aorist passive imperative, you'll notice that every single form here is based off of that second person plural luthete. So you'll see that the second singular lutheti has the iota, lutheto has the omega, and lutetosan has the osan ending. So I'm trying to give you strategies for thinking about the forms of the imperative rather than encouraging you to memorize all of them. So if you can remember that the second person plural is the sort of basis of the imperative for the second person plural imperative, the third person singular imperative, and the third person plural imperative, that will help you cover a lot of ground. And then you'll need to begin making yourself aware of those second singulars that are a little bit different or fall out of that pattern. And so as it comes to the second aorist imperatives are simply the second aorist stem plus those endings that we just saw. So that epsilon in the second singular, ete in the second plural, eto in the third singular, and etosan in the third plural for the active voice, and then for the middle, u, este, esto, estosan are those endings that we're looking for. Again, the idea here is to help you have some footholds to reduce the amount of memorization that you must do. With those forms of the imperative in mind, we can talk about the syntax of the imperative. The first thing to note is that tense in the imperative denotes kind of action, not necessarily or exclusively time of action. So a present tense imperative refers to prolonged or repeated action. An aorist is more undefined. Often, though, the translations will be very similar, if not the same, for both tenses. So there are two ways to express prohibitions. The first is using me plus the present imperative. The second is to use me plus the aorist subjunctive. Both of these are examples of prohibitions, saying what not to do. There are slightly different conceptions of the action being prohibited, however. When you see may plus the present imperative, that is sort of prohibiting an ongoing action. If you see may plus the aorist subjunctive, that is sort of a categorical prohibition. It is never acceptable, or surely not acceptable, to do that sort of behavior. So to get started with an example that will highlight some of the imperatives or the use of the imperatives, I want to look at exercise 1 in the practice and review. Hoi hamartaloi ekraxan kurie eleesan hemas kai me pempses hemas es krisin ionion. So to point out the presence of imperatives in this exercise, you'll see that there are positive imperatives. Eleison, hemas is an example of a positive prohibition or positive imperative. It is a command. And you can see I've tried to highlight those aspects that distinguish it. So it has a sigma, like the aorist imperative would, and then the on ending, which is the second singular ending. So we would parse this as aorist active imperative, second singular. There is also a negative imperative in this example, me pempses. And so you can see, again, I've tried to point out those different markers. The psi there is the result of the addition of the sigma, and the eta with the iota subscript is a lengthening of the present ending for the second singular. So we would parse this as an aorist active second singular. This is a prohibition, and because of its form, the me plus the subjunctive, it would be more of a categorical prohibition. Never send us would be one way of thinking about this as a translation. And so as I pointed out, context is key. The vocative form of kurios is kurie. And so often you'll see the vocative when there is an imperative. You are directly addressing somebody to do or not do something. And so with this information, we have enough ground to translate. So we would translate it something like, the sinners cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, and do not send us into eternal judgment. All right, that is a brief introduction to the imperative. We will see some of the imperative in the exercises, but also in the New Testament. And it's the sort of thing that you need to have a basic understanding of, but that you can come back to at a later time to get more information or a deeper understanding of the nuances of the imperative. Thank you for your attention.